Hello and welcome to Playlists, a 9-part series of programmes exploring different musical genres. My name's Andrew and I'm with the Irene Taylor Trust. Since 1995, we've been working with prisoners, former prisoners and young people in the community. Through creating original music, our musicians work alongside these groups to support them in telling their stories. We believe that creating music collaboratively can have a powerful and positive impact on people's lives. Each of these 9 programmes will focus on one broad genre of music, with a viewpoint to introducing you to different styles of music you might not have heard of and some artists that might be new to you. We've done this to give you a chance to listen to new music as well as learn a little bit more about different genres, which might open your ears to different styles of music you hadn't previously thought of listening to. It might also help you to develop your own songwriting, if that's something you do. Some of the genres we'll be covering include hip-hop, grime, classical, rock and global. So some you'll know and others you'll be less familiar with. You'll have the opportunity to listen and respond to some of the songs in this episode. So if you want to write down your answers or take notes, feel free to grab a pen now. If not, sit back and enjoy. In this episode, we'll be focusing on classical music. We'll be exploring the history of the genre, notable classical artists and tracks, as well as hearing an original piece of music that's been specially created for this programme. I'll be joined by musicians to discuss different aspects of the genre, which will give you ideas if at any stage you have the inspiration to write a track in this style. I'm joined by Sara Lee, the Artistic Director of the Irene Taylor Trust, who has been delivering and overseeing the running of music projects in prisons for over 35 years. Hello, Sara.
Hello, Andrew.
In this episode, we're focusing on classical music. I wonder, is classical music something that comes up a lot in your projects?
It's a genre which is really very much appreciated by people, but of course it takes a huge amount of time, years-wise, to actually learn to play the instruments. But I must say that we've had some of the best responses we've ever had when we've taken classical musicians into prisons to work, as I think the amount of time and skill it takes to play those instruments well is really respected. But the other thing we found is that classical instruments are not that, people are not familiar necessarily with classical instruments. So somebody sees a violinist playing an amazing thing or a trumpet player playing something, and later on in the week in the project they might go towards the synthesizer and find the string sound, and it completely blows their mind when they hear the sound that they've heard live, and they don't kind of quite know how to put it together.
The term classical music is incredibly broad, and the boundaries aren't particularly clear. Somehow a modern piece written for orchestra and electronics, a written piece for solo piano in the 18th century, and songs written for monks to sing in church 1,000 years ago can all be grouped under the heading of classical. The word classical itself was originally used to describe a particular period of Western musical history, roughly 1750 to 1820, which included such well-known composers as Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven. But over time, the word has become more commonly used as an umbrella term for perhaps over 1,500 years' worth of music making. Perhaps the most striking thing that sets classical music apart from other genres is the role of the composer, the person who writes the music. Classical music is almost always written down or notated in such a way that the musicians can perform it to an exact level of detail specified by the composer. Everything from the instruments to be used, to how loud or quiet the music is, how fast or slow it is, how long each note should be, and so on, is decided by the composer. The first era widely accepted to fall under the classical banner is known as the medieval period. This was roughly from 500 AD through to about the turn of the 13th century. Most of the music that we know about from this period was written for voice rather than instruments, and was religious in its nature, although there are examples of secular, non-religious music from this period as well. The periods of history widely accepted as the key markers in the evolution of classical music are medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, classical, Romantic and 20th century. We are now, of course, in the 21st century, and new classical music is still being written, so perhaps only in the future will music historians be able to coin a phrase to describe the musical world we are currently living in. So, here we are. Next, we'll be talking with a series of musicians who work with the Irene Taylor Trust to get a greater idea of what makes up this genre of music. Hi. So, I'm joined by Rob, who is one of our musicians, and Tobi, who's been working with us since its release, to talk more about classical music. So I guess to begin the conversation, what is it that you like about classical music? And Tobi, I might come to you first with that.
I think what I like most is its breadth. It covers a whole range of different sounds and styles, instruments, speeds, rhythms. And also, I think perhaps the complexity of it, it's there's a little bit more to it than a 3-minute pop song. Requires a little more commitment sometimes, not always.
And it just makes me curious to hear you talk about that, because of that breadth. There's so much in classical music. What would you say is a good entry point into classical music for someone who might want to explore the genre?
I think that's a difficult question, because there are so many entry points. I think lots of people encounter classical music without probably realizing it in soundtracks of films. Rob and I were talking about this yesterday. He mentioned computer games as well. There'll be themes people hear on adverts that start programs, and maybe that's enough to spark some interest. Someone really likes the sound of something that they identify as classical, and then they can find out who that composer is, maybe, and investigate the composer or the performer. That's one way to start. But always start with something you like.
Well, similar to Tobi, I trained classically, so I've been involved with classical music since I was young. So I suppose I never had that stigma attached to it of it being something big and scary and complicated. It was always quite accessible to me. And then since then, I don't think I always loved it as a kid. I think I've grown to love it more as I've grown older, because of the variety. There's so much there that you can delve into that could enhance your mood. It can calm you down. It can paint a picture in your head of 1,000 different things. There's just so much to it that I really recommend anyone to sort of dip their toes in and give it a try.
Yeah, out of that broad genre of music, are there any specific composers that are sort of favorites for you? And why might they be particularly favorited? Favorited? Yeah,
favorited. Yeah. Well, I think I've got so many, but I particularly like the Romantic period, which was sort of 19th century through to the beginning of the 20th century. So composers like Rachmaninoff, Chopin, through to Mahler and Sibelius. All of their works are really broad. Strauss is another one. They're really big. They're really emotive. They take you on a journey, for a cliche. They really do. And so you can sort of turn on the CD or Spotify or whatever you've got and just let it wash over you. So that would be my advice. And also, if someone's new to it, don't go straight in with a big, long symphony. There's no harm in putting on Classic FM and hearing some of the shorter classics that everyone knows and loves. That's a great way in.
I too really love the Romantic era, Chopin in particular. I like Debussy. But it's strange, because we're talking about something quite emotive, and the composer of choice for me would be Bach, who really is, less on the emotional side of things, although it can be found in there. As a piano player, learning when I was young, it was the first time, having sort of moved from Bach, if you like, into Chopin, that I discovered an emotional side to my playing. I was able to connect emotionally with music, and so it has a special relevance for that reason, I think.
I can imagine when you talk about the idea of playing music that is hundreds of years old, but actually classical it's quite unique in that regard. You are playing the music of Bach, which was, of a time in comparison to more modern music. And I know we spoke a little bit already around the sort of the breadth of classical music, but I'd be interested to find out what those subgenres of classical music are. Because I'm sure there's a breadth of those as well. So I'm going to come to Rob first with that. Rob, what are those subgenres of classical music, or are there any?
Yeah, I mean, there are too many to mention, I'd say. There's so many. And they tend to be divided on musical style or the instruments used. So, for example, you have choral music, which is singing. You have opera, which is more like theatre, but musical theatre, but classical based. You have symphonic music, which is the big symphony orchestras with 60, 70, 80 musicians playing. chamber music, which is the same kinds of instruments, but a very small group of them. And then into stylistic things, you have things like minimalism, impressionism, so many different things. And a lot of those stylistic things also tie in with movements that were happening in other creative art forms. So minimalism, impressionism, you'll find that in art and in creative writing and so many other things as well.
It's like asking who your favourite band is, or there's different music for different occasions, and not just occasions, different eras in your life, where you're dealing with or happy with, or whatever issues you face in life. There can often be a music that particularly chimes with you at that time. So yeah, I've been very vague, but as we've discussed, it's a very broad range of music, and so yeah, there are different favourites at different times.
I love your earlier tangent into the idea of classical music, because I guess when I think about classical music, I think of the stuff that we have recorded is all that there was. But actually, there must have been a vast variety of classical music from which we only listen to and have access to the best of the best. So really, when you're listening to classical music, I guess you're listening to what's been refined over hundreds of years as being the best, really. Which
you'd like to think so. I mean, obviously, that depends on different people's judgment. But I think, especially over a couple of hundred years, then people have had enough time to review and consider, and yes, come up with the best of the best.
Let's take a look at how classical music changed throughout the years through the eyes of one particular family of instruments, the keyboard family. The earliest keyboard instruments that we know of were organs. Organs work on the principle of air being blown through pipes. And pipe organs were the foremost keyboard instruments throughout the medieval period. During the early 16th century, a new invention came into prominence, the harpsichord. The sound of a harpsichord is created by strings being plucked, much like a harp, except it isn't the musician plucking the strings with their fingers. Instead, they play the notes on a keyboard, which causes a mechanical arm to pluck the strings. The harpsichord was a very important instrument throughout the Renaissance and Baroque periods. One problem with the harpsichord is that it can't play dynamics. That's to say, you can't change how loudly or quietly it's played. Everything just comes out at the same volume. Cue the invention of the pianoforte, literally translated as the quiet loud, which we now simply call the piano. Just like the harpsichord, the piano is a stringed instrument, but the strings are hit with hammers rather than plucked, giving the performer more control. The sound of the piano has of course changed and been refined over the years, but it's essentially the same instrument that composers have been writing for since the middle of the 18th century.
For somebody who is approaching classical music, perhaps for the first time, what advice would you give around engaging with an instrument? Because I imagine the idea that a lot of work needs to be put in might be a barrier for some. I mean, is there any sort of encouragement or advice you might give around approaching an instrument for the first time?
I mean that is tough because it can seem quite daunting, and I think it's about with same for anything new really, is to take your time with it and set realistic goals, because otherwise you're going to get overwhelmed with what you have to achieve. And I think all these instruments, they're perfectly playable for anyone of any age with any level of musical experience. You've just got to take your time with it, be realistic, find pieces of music that you enjoy, that you can achieve fairly early on, and get a good teacher. That's a really good advice, I'd say, because there's so much to learn. But if you have someone that you enjoy teaching you, that makes it fun and interesting, then you're going to win the battle, I think.
I love it. I love the idea of finding a fun and interesting teacher, because that must provide so much support, I guess. And I noticed, Tobi, you were talking about those instruments you have behind you. Maybe there's a 70% of proficiency you've got with them. So clearly,
if I'm lucky, yeah.
Yeah, it must be a work in progress always. But I guess question to you: what advice would you give to someone who is approaching an instrument, maybe classical or otherwise, for the first time?
I think, like Rob just said, baby steps, and also people put it on a pedestal like it's this really complicated thing to learn. It's no more complicated than learning how to play football well, or learning how to speak another language, or, it's just a series of lots of small steps. And if you don't have to commit to all of them, you just got to commit until you feel comfortable or bored. It's fair enough to say this isn't for me at some point if it isn't. But I think the more you put in, the more you get out.
That's lovely. And I guess it's going to tie in with, I guess, the theme of these programs as well, which is about broadening your own sort of knowledge of musical styles to be able to, I guess, benefit any particular style you want to move into, maybe. Which brings us, I guess, to the question of the day when it comes to classical music, which is classical music still relevant today? And if so, how? And I'm going to throw that to Rob first. Rob?
Yes, it definitely is. I think people are going to watch concerts as much as they ever have. It's more accessible now than it ever was because of recording technology. So anyone anywhere in the world can listen to classical music now. And like Tobi said earlier, classical music's everywhere. In virtually every film, TV program, video game, you're listening to it. And people may not always realize that they are, but it's there, and it's doing a great job in sort of creating the mood, setting the scene in things that you watch and do. So I think it's as relevant, if not more so than ever. I think maybe it's just that we don't always think that, because some of the music that's being written now is maybe quite not easy to listen to, perhaps the sort of the concert music, but that's only one very small aspect of classical music. I think one of the main things is that composers now aren't constrained by the rules. So when Tobi talks about Bach's sort of wrote the book on harmony, that was then followed quite rigidly for a long, long time, and it still is in many cases. But these days, composers are just trying new things out. They're not constricted by rules as much. So you get a real array of sounds and colours and noises from modern classical music.
It's interesting seeing how, because of the variety of media now, there's a whole lot more subgenres being developed, because, as Rob said, the freedom to experiment's a lot higher now, a lot less rigid. Even in universities where people learn classical music, they're learning all types of, and have been for 100 years, of different ways of writing that really sort of break the mold. And whether classical music's relevant now or not, there are lots of great composers now that write in not just modern styles. There are still impressionist, minimalist, romantic composers. So if you have a style of music you like classically, there's probably someone having a go at something similar now.
I love just hearing about the breadth of, I guess, variety within classical music. So it sounds like there is a way in to it, no matter what your perspective or your particular enjoyment with it. And I love the idea as well of it being a constant evolving experiment, classical music. And it feels like that's got a future to it as well. So it definitely feels relevant from the discussion. Here is a track that we've created specially for this episode, which was written in the style of classical music. We paired up one of our project team with someone from our Sounding Out program to co-create a track. When listening to it, see if there's anything you recognise from things we've spoken about earlier in the program. Rob, this was the first time that you've heard this song. I wonder what stood out to you.
I think it's really clever. It's a famous tune, the Paganini tune. And what they've done with this is quite clearly taken it through the ages, and each variation is a different point in music history. It's very cleverly done. And then you have the sound of the clarinet carrying through the whole piece. It's fantastic.
Excellent, thank you. Tobi, when we asked you to create a song in the classical genre, I wonder what were the 2 or 3 things that you had to do to ensure that what you created was authentic?
The other musician I worked with is also classically trained, and we discussed this, how do we get this across? What are we trying to get across? And as we've discussed all throughout this, it's about breadth and the wide range of styles. And one of the things you do when you study music is something called Pastiche, where you try and emulate how a composer writes in a particular style. And we thought that would be good for this because it's been done already. Paganini was like the rock star of his day, if you like, the very first. Tight trousers, screaming women, flashy lifestyle. And he wrote a series of these caprices, like jolly things to play, so he could show off. And this was number 20, I think number 24. I'm not entirely sure, you'd have to double check. But it's a theme that lots of people have improvised around since. Rachmaninoff, who was mentioned by Rob earlier, one of the Romantic composers, did variations on the theme by Paganini, which was this one. And right up to rock musicians doing the theme to the South Bank show. It's been used in a lot of different ways. And I might argue that in 100 years' time, rock might be considered classical music too.
That was a fascinating discussion. It was great to learn so much in such a short period of time. So my thanks to both of you, Rob and Tobi. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching this episode of Playlists. I hope you enjoyed learning more about this genre of music and hearing some tracks that maybe you haven't heard before. These will give you a greater understanding of the different components that make up this musical style, as well as some ideas for creating your own song. See you next time when we'll be exploring another musical genre.